Our understanding of coaching is rooted in the insight that any organization succeeds based on the degree to which the individual in the organization makes an unconditional contribution to the objectives of the organization. So we have our three bakers analogy. Let's say three bakers collaborate to bake a cake, and at the end of the month, each baker takes a slice home and there's a slice left. We would call that slice the surplus. And the surplus is the measure of the success of the enterprise. And that only exists, the surplus only exists because the total cake that was baked was bigger than what each individual took home. So these bakers produce a surplus and succeed when the average person in the business gives more than what they take in pursuit of the group's objectives. And people do this mainly for people. That's very important. If you want to understand the conditions under which people are going to go the extra mile, then in a sense you need to understand, who's the boss. The most profound reason for people to come to work to make a contribution really has to do with how the group is led. And unfortunately, if you ask the average boss, what does being in charge actually mean? He's going to say to you, leadership is about achieving a result through people. Now, this understanding that leadership is about achieving a result through people is actually deeply toxic. If your definition of leadership is consistent with the view that leadership is about achieving a result through people, you'll not make givers who work because they want to, but you'll make takers who work because they have to. And we have a thought experiment that really helps to demonstrate this. So let's say you've got two people working for you. The one is called Joe and the other one is called Fred. And what we're going to try and work out is which one of these two are going to work for you because they have to, and who's going to work for you because they want to. So let's assume in the Fred case, you say to Fred, in 2000, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. Go and do what I did. You say to Joe, in 2000, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. It may be helpful to you. Take a look at it. Now, if this is your approach, then clearly Fred's going to work for you because he has to, and Joe's going to work for you because he wants to. And the question is, what makes those two interactions different? It would appear that in the Joe case, the key to the difference is that Joe has a decision which Fred can't take. So in a sense, it's a more democratic engagement with Joe. But the real distinction between these two interactions lies deeper than that. It lies in the intent of the boss. Because if you separate these two variables in your mind, means and ends, and you put into those two categories either the person is doing the job or the job that's being done, and we examined the Fred interaction. If you said to Fred in 2000, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked, go and do what I did, then your end is to get the job done. And by definition, you're using Fred, the person, as your means to get the job done. In the Joe interaction, something quite strange is happening if we assumed that you were serious, you meant what you said. If your intent was exactly as you articulated, that Joe, in 2000 I did what you have to do and what I did worked, it may be helpful to you, take a look at it, then clearly your end is not to get the job done. Your end is actually to teach Joe something. Your end is the person. And what gives you the opportunity to teach him something is the job that he's doing. So there's an inversion of means and ends in these two statements. And that inversion of means and ends helps us to understand what the real shift in the two interactions are. That shift sits at the level of intent. If we asked Fred, who do you experience as the beneficiary of this interaction? Fred will say, well, it's the boss. The boss is trying to take something from me. If we asked Joe the same question, he would say, it's me. The boss is trying to be helpful to me. And unfortunately, if we think of leadership through this lens, if we say leadership is about achieving a result through people, then we're actually talking about the Fred interaction, because it is in the Fred case where the person becomes the means in order to achieve a result. So for us to be consistent with a Joe interaction, we would have to say something like leadership is about achieving people through results. And although this might be somewhat shocking, it actually makes sense if you consider the relationship between the coach and the team in a team sport like soccer, because this is exactly what a coach does. A coach's job is clearly not to achieve a result. That's what the players are there for. The coach's job is to coach the player. That doesn't mean to say the coach has got no interest in the game that's being played or the result that's being achieved. He's got to know what's happening on the scoreboard, he's got to know what's happening on the field, but he uses that information to coach the player, which basically suggests that the coach does not use the player to get a job done and to achieve a result. He uses the result as his means to enable the player. So this is a very helpful way of understanding what the leader needs to do to his understanding or her understanding of their role, if they want to shift the direction of service in the reporting relationship. If they wanted to create the conditions where they're not taking from the subordinate but giving to the subordinate, then they have to understand that their deliverable is the growth of the person, and the job that's being done is, in a sense, their means to that end. If you wanted to empower somebody, then we've got this rule of thumb that says don't give a man a fish, empower him to fish. And clearly, if you wanted to empower somebody to fish, then you would first of all give them some stuff. You'd give them, hook, a line, and a sinker, and a bottle of beer and some sunglasses. You'd also teach the person stuff. You'd teach them how to bait a hook and where to cast and so on. And the difference between those two categories is the first category is about things. You can call it, in a sense, hardware. We call it means. And the second category you can call ability. However, those two categories aren't adequate, because let's assume you're dealing with somebody who's particularly lazy and you give them all the means and the ability to do what's required of them, but you're also a nice person and you've got a freezer full of fish. And you then say to this person, listen, if you don't catch a fish, don't worry, I'll give you one from my freezer. That person's not going to be very willing in this whole fishing escapade. So it means the last thing that you've got to bring to the party to really engage the person's will is a kind of bloody mindedness. You have to be willing to say to the person, if you don't catch fish, starve, which basically says the person must also be held accountable, which suggests that empowering people means three things and not just two. It means to give the person the means to do what's required of them, make them able to do what's required of them, and to hold them accountable. Now, consistent with the idea of means in an organizational sense would be things like giving the person the tools, the resources, the authority, the information, a clear standard, the boss's time. Further to that, making the person able would suggest that you teach the person how to do the job and why the job should be done. And then finally, if you're holding the person accountable, that suggests that you basically consistently either recognize, reward, censure, or punish the person against the standard. Now, when one looks at this instrument from this point of view, it becomes apparent that there's a necessary order to this, because it's clear that you cannot hold somebody accountable if you've not given them the means or the ability to do what's required of them, which basically says that in this process of empowering somebody, you can make two mistakes, and we call those two mistakes the difference between the soft and the hard mistakes. The hard mistake is when you treat means and ability issues as if they are accountability issues. So the person either doesn't have the means to do what's required of them, you haven't taught them how to do what's required of them, their performance is below standard, and you punish them. That's the hard mistake. The soft mistake is the inverse of this. The soft mistake is to treat means and is to treat accountability issues as if they are means and ability issues. You have given the person all the means they require, they're perfectly able to do what they require, their performance is below standard, and you go teach them something or you coach them. And of these two mistakes, the soft mistake is infinitely worse than the hard mistake, because it's, in a sense, the equivalent of leaving the rotten apple in the barrel. It's also the mistake that gets done most frequently in organizations, because people very often see accountability issues as issues that you coach people for. And to coach people for accountability issues is, in fact, to commit the soft mistake. When you're coaching somebody, you're dealing with ability issues. The further thing that is really apparent when one uses this coaching metaphor is that actually, by far, most of the work that the coach does is observational. The coach can't do his job if he's not watching the game. Basically, you can't coach a game you're not watching. Then clearly at some point, the subordinate, if you like, the player comes off the field, and the boss and the subordinate have a conversation about the subordinate's performance. that conversation has a structure. It starts off with a review, basically kind of diagnostically assessing the player or the coachee's performance. And then that review then turns into setting of the task in such a way that when the person does the job, they're going to learn something from doing it. It suggests one of the key differences between an ordinary reporting relationship and a coaching relationship is that what becomes deliverable in a coaching relationship is not just that the job gets done, but there's a change in the competency by the person who's doing the job, which is why when the person returns to the work, the coach has to monitor, has to, on occasion, glance at what's happening in the field to assess whether the person is actually learning what's required of them. And then that gives them an opportunity to have another reporting conversation, which suggests that reporting relationships that's rooted in a coaching cycle basically oscillates between two elements. There's a reflection part, and that what I mean by the reflection part, this is where the coach and the athlete talk about the performance of the athlete, and then there's an action part where the athlete goes off and does the job. If one wanted to kind of have a bit of almost a framework in order to be able to plan a coaching relationship, this following grid is a useful one to use. So what we have here is an example that comes from an engineering function in a manufacturing environment. And so the coachee is the foreman, is an engineering foreman, and the coach is the foreman's boss, the engineer. The routine task that the foreman does on an average day are those 19 points, and we won't read through all of them, but you can get a sense of, what his routine day would look like. He arrives at work, he reads a breakdown report, he checks a maintenance schedule, attends a morning meeting, and so on. Now, let's assume that the learning opportunity for this foreman is that he's not planning very well, and he doesn't maintain very good discipline in his section, assuming that. Now, this in most reporting relationships gets completely unidentified because it gets overlooked. Because if you sort of wanted to find out how the engineer viewed his relationship with the foreman, his fundamental kind of understanding is that his job is to achieve a result through the foreman. And it means that his attention hones in on very specific areas of what the foreman does. These are the areas that actually are most germane to the result that the foreman produces. So the foreman attends the morning meeting with the production manager and the engineer to discuss priorities. The foreman completes a task list for the engineer and reports to the engineer on work completed. If the engineer wanted to develop the foreman's planning muscle, then clearly he would emphasize very different things. He would start looking at the breakdown report, but he would look at the breakdown report from the view of trying to identify whether there are gaps in how the foreman sets out a maintenance plan. He would also check the maintenance schedule. He'd try and understand how the foreman has decided to set priorities when he's having this morning meeting with the foreman. He would also check on work in progress. And he would check on work in progress to see whether the foreman actually is acting consistently with his plan. He'd work out, try and understand how the foreman sets priorities, how the foreman deals with breakdowns, what the foreman looks at when he does a floor walk, and also how the foreman deals with reports that he receives from artisans. If the engineer wanted to give attention to the foreman's ability to discipline, he would pick up a very different set of tasks that really put pressure, if you like, on the foreman's disciplinary muscle. When the foreman checks work in progress, when he meets with artisans to assign work, or when he reassigns work to an artisan, also when he does floor walks to check on progress, when he deals with a disciplinary inquiry, etc. Now, the key benefit for doing this is, let's assume that the engineer is basically also making a deliverable in his relationship with the foreman, that the foreman's discipline improves. Assuming he does that, then we must understand that one element, fixing discipline, actually affects a number of issues, 5 issues or 6 issues actually, in the foreman's day-to-day task, and that clearly that improves many of the tasks that the foreman does, and will obviously have a profound effect on results. Now, when the engineer is using this approach diagnostically, it's quite feasible for him to start off with looking at the results, but then he needs to ask himself, why are those results as they are? If the results are inadequate, he's got to ask himself, what is the foreman doing that's causing that? But then, in a sense, doing his watching of the foreman's game, he will notice that in areas that actually have an effect on discipline, the foreman is actually not giving adequate attention. And based then on his observation, he would then have the conversation with the foreman, where the deliverable of that conversation would be that the foreman learns to discipline better. In applying this approach remedially, what the engineer now has to ask himself is which of the tasks can he use, in a sense like apparatus or apparati in a gymnasium. I mean, if you want to build somebody's biceps, you wouldn't put them on a bicycle, you'd put them on a bench press. So the foreman, the engineer rather, identifies the elements of the foreman's task that will put pressure on that learning requirement. The engineer then also specifies what learning outcome he would like to see for each one of these tasks, or the particular tasks that he's going to ask the coachee or the foreman to report on. He would then check what the foreman does in the critical parts to the job where these competencies are going to be at issue, so that you'll be able to see whether the coachee really is realizing this learning opportunity. That game watching is actually quite feasible for him to schedule in a calendar.